Good afternoon. You are listening to A Path to a New You, a podcast about mental health and veterans issues. I am your host, Tim. I'm located in Madison, Wisconsin, and I do about one episode a week. Today is Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. It's a federal holiday. And also, in this episode, I do have a guest. This guest, her name is Anne. I've known her for several years, and we're going to be talking about perfectionism. So that is the topic we're going to be talking about today. She's going to be on here in a few minutes, and with that last around the last week or so, I posted a question about perfectionism, and I asked if people had questions about the topic, and a few of you did respond. And so I sent her those questions, and I hope you learn something about perfectionism today. Again, you're listening to A Path to New You, a podcast about mental health and veterans issues, and today's topic is perfectionism. And we will be talking to our guest Anne here in a few short minutes. You are listening to A Path to New You. Today I have a special guest. I've known her for I don't know how many years, 10 years, probably more than that actually.
Yeah, a while.
Her name's Anne, and today our topic is on perfectionism. How are you, Anne, today? How are you?
I'm doing really good, and yeah, you were saying I had to think, like, I think it's been over 10 years because that was my first official position out of my master's program, which was that was, like, 12 years ago. That's
That
wild.
was that journey, wasn't it? Was it that journey?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was wild. That was a
Oh,
long
that
time
was a while
ago.
ago, yes. All right.
That's cool, though.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about perfectionism, and that's one of the specialties that I guess I would say you work clients who are in that area, correct?
Yep, so a lot of individuals I see, I work across the lifespan, primarily teens and young adults are my specialties, and their families and couples, so relational therapy. And I do a lot with, either OCD-like traits or people with perfectionistic traits. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Cool. So the first question, I sent you some questions that I got
Yeah,
from friends and whatnot through Facebook. First question I have is, what exactly is perfectionism?
yeah, and I love that you just asked that because people kinda go into the clinical stuff,
Yeah.
right? But the working definition, anytime somebody asks about perfectionism, is always good to know. So I always say it's like overinflated expectations, right? One of the phrases I use is exceeds expectations is the meets expectations for that person, and sometimes can be unrealistic for themselves and sometimes other people in their relationship. And the tricky thing is I think a lot of perfectionists, because it's their baseline, people will say, "How do you do all of that? How does that happen?" Right? It gets very romanticized, or they get pedestaled because they're saying, wow, they can do all those things. It's so amazing. Yet the perfectionist is using a lot of executive functioning in their brain and a lot of work
Sounds like it.
to upkeep that expectation. Think about it. If you work at 150% all the time, what that does to your brain and body.
It sounds really stressful.
Yeah, right. That's a good way to put it. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
All right. The second question I have, what triggers perfectionism? Is there like a trigger, some sort of trigger?
Yeah, I love that question too. And I put even just like a couple notes, a different and because I'm kind of a neuroscience theoretical nerd, I like giving a little bit of those backgrounds. So anytime I give information, I tell people, even in my podcast, or I will hear, it gives you a place to start research. It's not the end all be all, right? It's things to consider, even if you're listening to this as a perfectionist or recovering perfectionist yourself. But what we do know for now, as of 2024, is that people aren't born perfectionistic. Perfectionism oftentimes is some sort of learned behavior, whether through our own coping skills or through others. So that's the first one is learning theory, right?
Hmm.
We observe things around us, we see what works, we see what doesn't. It could be a caregiver, parent. A parent, a sibling, could be a mentor that you really look up to, like at school. Um, but the whole thing is we build learning theory off experience. So what works and what doesn't. So then there's systemic theory or therapy, which as a licensed marriage and family therapist, we use a lot of systems theory. It's the core of our work.
mhm,
But that again, people around us that we've watched or observed, it's the exact same concept. We admire something and about, right? We might admire something in what somebody else does. Um, and it turns to we want to be like that. Right?
right.
Maybe we have a parent that's perfectionistic in a lot of ways or has high expectations and we admire it. So we want to be that way. On the flip side, it could sometimes lead from even parts of trauma, which I'll go into a little bit, where people had neglect or didn't get a lot of attention. So a lot of the times people that's the way they got validation. That's the way that they were seen was to utilize achievement in some way to get attention or positive attention, or on the flip side, to get no attention. So sometimes, even when there's abuse, like physical or other forms, sometimes perfectionism will develop to so they don't get looked at, right?
Mhm,
Nothing is wrong. I'm okay. You don't need to look my way. Things are all right. So, as far as in early childhood, our past experiences really impact something called inner critics, um, which leads to sometimes internal family systems, which is another type of theorem in psychotherapy. Internal family systems is one of the evidence bases for trauma work. And they were one of the major drivers of inner critics, which is major areas of inner critics inside of us that impact how we respond to the world around us, including ourselves. And perfectionism is one of that. And science has shown that perfectionism can be a part of survival mechanisms. So even as we move forward and say what triggers it today, and I say I am a recovering perfectionist. That's why I work really well with perfectionists because
mhm,
I've done the work alongside them. Um, is that when you look at these things later on in life, what triggers it is sometimes when you're not feeling like you're achieving or you feel like the world is really stressful. Sometimes people become workaholics or they go back to school a lot or they have multiple tasks or it just depends how they define achievement. But then they go into it almost like how a workaholic or an addict would. And I do believe in a lot of ways the way I treat perfectionistic traits, I use internal family systems and similar to work with addiction, it's almost like it keeps them afloat in some ways. And then the third thing is culture, right? You need to think
mhm,
of social learning theory or social psychology. We're surrounded by grind culture, right? I mean, the world around us impacts us like micro, meso, macro, right? I mean, it impacts us where we're seeing a lot more in Gen Z and millennials, more perfectionistic traits than we ever have.
mhm,
And that culture of achievement or perceived achievement, right?
mhm,
Grind, do more, exceed instead of meet, right? Even people, let's look at the ACTs for um, going to college. I mean, the expectations, even though the average has not changed very much, the expectation at the colleges, I even think of it was, I mean, 24 when I was going to school was high. That was what UW-Madison was. Now the average is like 30 to 36. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like, and
yeah,
36 is the top. So,
yeah,
the world around us is expecting more out of us. So sometimes perfectionism peaks because achievement is the way for validation and survival.
mhm. So the next question I have, sounds like you answered some of it. So what
Mhm.
problems does a perfectionism cause?
Yeah, the kind of when we were talking about,
Yeah,
like, the mindset
yeah,
exceeds, right, the meats, it's unrealistic, and no brain can manage that long term, and I can say that for myself. People often say to, like, "Oh, I don't know how you do all those things," and I look at them, I said, "I don't either."
right.
I don't either, and the reality is executive functioning, that frontal part, that frontal lobe, it eventually runs out, and anybody listening that is a perfectionist right now, there's ways to make it healthy that it's less about survival and more about the thrival, right?
Mhm,
Um, but the thing is it's those expectations long term are irrational and they're unrealistic. And eventually, the brain and the body from stress cannot handle all of those things. Doesn't matter how intelligent somebody is, doesn't matter the skill sets they have. It's about what the actual evolving body and brain can and cannot do,
Mhm.
you know? And I think the second one that I thought about and wrote about was which is kind of a weird problem to talk about. People romanticize perfectionism. They are the oftentimes leaders are put up on pedestals. It's the socially acceptable inner critic. I mean, think of when we talk about addiction, I say, things like food and relationships are socially acceptable, but drugs and alcohol aren't. So which
Yeah.
ones are villainized, right?
Right.
Um, Perfectionism and as an inner critic is not villainized, it's encouraged. And to me, that is a long term problem because that's how people feel that they're going to get love
Mhm.
or going to be seen is to do more with less. And I think it needs to be the opposite, which think of in our work, Tim. I think of when a lot of perfectionists go into our field as therapists and when they start their jobs, they push themselves, they push, they push, they push in the first 6 months or whatever it may be. And then they get compassion fatigue or burnt out.
Mhm.
They get to their late 20s or 30s and they come to therapy with one of us and say, I can't do it anymore. And I said, I mean, yeah, of course you can't. Right. Or it affects their relationships, which that's the hardest part is how perfectionism eventually that all or nothing thinking, which
Yep.
in cognitive behavioral therapy, we talk about is a thinking trap. It's a cognitive distortion. And that's what perfectionists do. It's either all good or all bad. It's either I'm doing it or I'm not. And they
Right.
guilt themselves anytime they slow down. So the effect that that has on your self-worth and self-esteem, and eventually you're using up all your energy on your achievements when you come home to your relationships and there's nothing left.
Mhm.
And people are tired. And I think the final one, which is the most important, and I always like to give trigger warnings if any sort of suicide risk topics come up, is passive perfectionism, which is absolutely a potential problem of all or nothing thinking. It's a risk factor to suicide, in fact. And it's that passive perfectionism is they become so incredibly fearful about making mistakes that they either reduce making decisions or stop altogether.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's when you see a straight A student and they stop going to school. They stop going to class. And when they have that as their source of self-worth, you can see how that would turn to suicide risk.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
Yeah. So I think of those are the major areas. So if a lot of the times these symptoms don't get talked about or managed, whether people choose formal therapy or other resources, there are other ones like coaches and things like that. Even though I'm a therapist, I'm open to people heal on their own terms, but it's getting help and facing how perfectionism can hurt you
Mhm.
if you don't manage it or learn how to make it healthy.
Right. The other question I have, I think you kind of answered a lot of these, actually, most of these questions already. What is the biggest weakness of being a perfectionist?
Yeah, I thought about that question. I always say like I thought of like, weakness versus challenge. I think of the probably the biggest challenge is scaling back and knowing that achievement does not define your worth or your love.
Mhm.
It's living a fulfilling life and how to do that besides those things. And when you've attached it for so long, that I think really understanding that's probably the biggest challenge. I'd use that word rather than weakness. Like, I do think that that's the hardest thing for people to understand because they've been doing it for so long. They don't know what else to grab onto. And it can lonely, feel lonely, or
Mhm.
be alone for a little while, which is a hard place to be because somebody who achieves a lot often feels alone or is alone or feels lonely frequently. So I kind of say it's going to be a little bit heavier than that for a little while as you redefine this because we're going to sit with things and not grind. We're going to say no to people at work a little more. It's exposure work. I use a lot of OCD like exposure response
Mhm.
prevention work and teaching people like sitting with saying no.
Right.
sitting with doing nothing. That's hard for people. It gets physically I tell people, "You will be physically uncomfortable in this process."
Yeah.
So I'd say that's my answer to that one.
Yeah, I can relate too. I used to say yes all the time, especially when I was working at Journey. I said yes a
Yeah,
lot,
right.
so I took people's shifts, and then eventually I had to start saying no because again I was getting burnt out and all that. So yeah,
Mhm.
I can relate to that.
110. I think a lot of us in this field do, Tim. Like, I think that as we teach and even do this in our podcast, the more that we get out there and say that no is enough.
Yep,
You don't need to explain yourself,
yep,
even if you're off that day, and just saying, "No, I don't wanna take that shift today." And
right,
that doesn't and here's the thing, if somebody likes you less because you say no, that has nothing to do with you,
right, exactly,
right? That has
exactly,
to do with their issues with boundaries or not being able to find their own resources or self-regulate,
right.
but no is enough, and you absolutely can say that, and that's really hard for perfectionists to think about and face.
Hmm. So the last question I have, is perfectionism helpful in any way?
Absolutely. I really encourage anybody listening to look up healthy perfectionism. That absolutely is. Just like with internal family systems work, one of the things that we talk about is making friends with it. One of the talks I did with Dream Bank was about inner critics and how to make friends with it when you think of yourself sitting at the head of the table, right? Normally, when inner critics are at the head of the table, we feel really a lot of cognitive dissonance. We feel like really hard on ourselves. We beat ourselves up a lot emotionally. Um, and like internal family systems, some of that work, or people that know about IFS, like myself or others, you really begin to realize that you can have perfectionism at the table, just not at the head of it.
Hmm.
You're at the head of it.
Right,
Your empowered self, who you're supposed to be, is at the head of it, or who you know you are at your best. And sometimes you got to look at your perfectionism and say, I got this. I know you're trying to help or I need some input, but I don't want you to run the show. But the biggest thing is perfectionists, they give great input because they're dreamers and they're pushers and they're leaders and they have these leadership roles in their mind. They're often role models. I'm
hmm,
kind of externalizing it like IFS does, but this part of ourselves that's perfectionistic because it's not all we are. It's a
hmm,
part of us. Um, they're role models to peers, they're mentors, they enjoy bringing people up. You'll often see that, like I said, a lot of perfectionists are pedestaled, right? But that's because they have very, very, very big hearts. If that's anything that I've realized, a lot of perfectionists, they became it because they saw somebody with a big heart be a perfectionist, or they wanted to be what they didn't have.
right,
And the weirdest thing for me to tell people about perfectionism is a lot of people think they're selfish because they're achievers. A lot of them will come in and be like, it's interesting because, somebody called me a narcissist the other day and they're like, but I beat myself up all the time and I come to therapy and I'm the total opposite. And it took me, 25 years to say no to people. And they're like, I'm so far from selfish, but that person called me selfish. And that was so confusing to me because all I do is work, 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 work.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
And I think to look at a perfectionist and say that, like, it regardless of intention, but it's important to know that they do it so nobody else has to worry.
that makes
Nobody has
sense.
to worry about them, and nobody has to worry about anything. They take care of everything because, again, you can see how that would give them some achievement or validation, but you can see too much of anything is also not good and how that would
Right,
affect relationships. You can't do everything. You can't control everything. There's a controlling part to it. So I think that how to look at it can help you do great things with little resources, yet not taking it too far. And I also think perfectionists are independent thinkers. I think they're innovative. Um, I think that they step outside the box and can do what's right when no one else can because they don't normally need sometimes validation from people, not
hmm,
all of them.
hmm,
Sometimes they don't need validation from people, but the work is their validation, right? That it's for the greater good or
right,
whatever. Um, but healthy perfectionism definitely exists and you can make friends with it. And I think a lot of great leaders have been perfectionists and have channeled it to good. And I do think that that that's possible.
right. Is there anything else you wanted to add to what we just talked about?
You know, I always love those ending questions. I didn't think so because like I said, I like anything connected with anybody as they listen to this. Take it as a start of a conversation and go research things. Never listen to one person and think that it's the end all be all, even though I'm a specialist in the field or that's what I do. And I've been doing it for, 13 plus years. I really encourage, I'm one human, I'm one therapist. But if you heard anything, a theory, a topic, even healthy perfectionism, take for a second opinion and a third and a fourth and a fifth and look online and do your research. And
Right,
if you really think that you're struggling or it's something that, it's difficult to get past, there's absolutely no shame, even if it's your first time, asking for help.
right,
Because I do not believe we can do life alone. And perfectionists, I'm saying this even for myself, self reflecting myself as a recovering perfectionist. I even need to remind myself in recovery sometimes I cannot do this alone. It is not a codependent statement. It is a reality of human beings. We are communal creatures. We evolve from our communities and from people who help us. And some of us, I would say all of us, sometimes, you know, we need help, and it's okay to ask for it. It's okay to ask for it.
yeah. It took me forever to start asking for help. I used to try to do everything my own, and yeah, all of a sudden I just couldn't do it anymore. I'd reach out to people and ask for help, and it takes time. It takes practice too, because it's difficult if you've never done that before. So yeah,
Mhm.
definitely.
It is. It's like I mean, really, it's a physical, visceral experience to ask for help when you've been taking care of everything yourself for so long.
Right.
I remember a time when I realized my perfectionism had really won because I was going into my undergraduate career and I was talking to my grandpa, and again, great human. He's actually an ex-Marine. Well, was. He's not with us anymore. Um, and very good man and very balanced with emotions and thoughts, very high IQ, probably one between my brother, smart brother and mom, like
Mhm,
that side of my family, it's my maternal grandfather, very smart. And my mom was like, "You got any advice,
mhm.
for your uh, one of your youngest grandkids?" And he was like, "No, Annie's got this." Like, and it was just, he just looked at me and goes, "I don't worry about her." And it was interesting because I realized it was supposed to be sweet, right? Like it was supposed to
Mm,
be, she's got this. It was an empowerment statement. But yet at 18, I was literally like, yeah, but I'd like somebody to check in on me once in a while
right.
because I was really good at masking and that things were okay. And I knew how to because of my intelligence, what I learned and everything else. And I think what my perfectionism taught me is just that, don't ask for help and make sure that everybody else is okay because they're busy. So don't bother them, which is not, my parents were all very open. The strange thing about me is both my parents are very good people and were very present and got us involved in sports. There was a lot of good things about my childhood. For me, my perfectionism really came from because I respected them and they were busy. They were both business and pretty high up in what they did. My perfectionism, even though they were there, it was like, don't bother them. They got a lot going on with the older siblings.
Yeah.
I was the youngest, and my older siblings were they were really good people and troublemakers. So it was kind of like, don't make more problems for them. So my perfectionism really came from admiration and staying quiet so they didn't feel bothered.
Mhm,
Um, so it wasn't from neglect, it wasn't from abuse, it wasn't from trauma. They were very much present. It was out of admiration. So everyone's story, or anyone that's listening to this, your story might be different. It's not always trauma that
mhm,
it comes from, but, um, eventually, if you feel like, "Man, I wish somebody would ask," go to the people that are closest to you and just say, like, "Can you check in on me once in a while because I put on a good front?"
mhm,
Um, Sometimes things are hard.
mhm. So if someone wanted to reach out to you, do you have like a website or something that they can reach out to you if needed, if they want questions or anything.
Yeah, of course. So I actually do have a LLC and a business. So I have AnneTotero.com. Actually, on all social media platforms, anyone you can think of, if you look up Anne Totero, thank goodness I'm the only one with that name.
Mhm.
If you look up anything, I have a TikTok, I have an Instagram, I have a Facebook, all of my content there. And I also have a podcast, Skull Meatloaf Podcast with Anne Totero. It's on all platforms, anything from Apple to Amazon to anywhere else. It's on its 7th season starting 2024. So you can check me out there. You can reach out to me if you're thinking about clinically reaching out to me. I do work locally here at UW Health, and I am accepting new patients. So if there's, and that's just for now, anybody that listens to this in the future, this is just as of
Mhm.
1/15/2024 that I'm saying this, but always reach out and mention if you really want to work on perfectionism or young adult or you're a parent of a perfectionist,
Yeah.
always feel free to like reach out. And if I'm not open, I'll tell you and I'll give you resources. If I am open, I'll tell you. And I'd love to help any way that I could. But clinically, as a therapist, I'm only available at UW Health in Madison right now.
Sounds great. So, if you could send me those links, and I can just post
Yeah.
them in my comment thing, whatever, for the episode. I'll post everything there, so people are listening and didn't quite catch your email or
Yeah.
website or anything. They can go to the podcast and find the information there. All
Sounds
right.
good. Yeah, I
So
could do that.
I really appreciate you coming on and talking about perfectionism. I hope people learn a little bit about it at least. And again,
Me too.
yeah, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Thank you, and it was good to see you after, a chunk of time.